In March 1741, before a shot was fired at Cartagena de Indias, England had already declared victory. The mints in London had stamped thousands of coins celebrating a triumph that had not happened. On those medals, a Spanish commander knelt in the dirt, begging Admiral Vernon for mercy. That coin became the most embarrassing object in British history. The inscription mocked the enemy openly. It read that Spanish pride had been humbled by Admiral Vernon, church bells were being cast, parades planned, the press had crowned Vernon a living god. To the British Empire, the fall of Cartagena was not a battle to be won. It was a formality, a party thrown before the war even started. But here is the question that should stop you cold. How does the most powerful navy on earth mint the trophies of a victory it has not won, against a city defended by a man most had already dismissed as a broken cripple? What did London see that made them so certain, and what did they fail to see? Because the man on those coins kneeling and begging was never going to kneel. His name was Blas de Lezo, and by 1741, his body was already a monument to survival. At 15, a cannonball tore off his left leg below the knee. He did not retire. He kept fighting, and the sea kept taking pieces of him. A few years later, an explosion during a siege destroyed his left eye. Later still, enemy grapeshot shredded his right arm and left it hanging useless at his side for the rest of his life. One leg gone, one eye gone, one arm dead. His men had a name for him that was almost cruel. They called him the Half-Man. Now picture the arithmetic of that spring. Against this half-blind, half-crippled admiral, Britain sent the largest war fleet the world had ever seen. 186 warships, 3,000 cannons, 15,000 sailors, and 30,000 elite soldiers hungry for Spanish silver. It was a force larger than the famous Spanish Armada of 1588. And what did Blas de Lezo have to stop them? 6 ships, 3,000 men. That is a ratio of 10 to 1 in soldiers, 30 to 1 in ships. By every rule of military mathematics ever written, defending Cartagena was not merely difficult, it was suicide. London knew this perfectly well. That is exactly why they minted the coins. But Lezo understood something the British Admiralty had forgotten. He knew the bigger the empire, the harder it falls when arrogance is steering. He knew 30,000 men, in a swamp, in the heat, with no time and no patience, were not a strength. They were a target, and he was about to turn the whole Caribbean into a trap. To understand why Britain wanted this city so badly, see what Cartagena actually was. It was not just a colonial port. It was the throat of an empire. Nearly all the silver and gold pulled from Spanish America flowed through its harbor before crossing to Europe. Whoever held Cartagena held their hand around the neck of the Spanish economy itself. And the excuse for the war was almost insultingly small. 2 years earlier, a British merchant captain named Robert Jenkins stood before Parliament and lifted a jar of alcohol into the air. Floating inside it was a severed, rotting human ear. He swore a Spanish patrol had sliced it from his head while searching his ship for smuggled goods. The chamber erupted. Newspapers screamed for blood. An entire nation demanded vengeance for one man's ear. But you already know no empire sends 30,000 soldiers across an ocean over a piece of cartilage in a jar. The War of Jenkins' Ear was never about the ear. It was about the silver. The ear was just the costume greed wore. So the fleet came. On the 13th of March, 1741, the people of Cartagena climbed their walls, looked out, and the sea was gone. In its place stood a forest of masts so dense the horizon vanished behind British sails. For an ordinary commander, that sight alone would have been the end. Surrender would have felt like mercy. Blas de Lezo did not blink. He had already accepted a brutal truth. In open water, his 6 ships against their 186 would last minutes, not hours. A naval battle was a fantasy, so he made a decision so strange his own officers must have questioned his sanity. He decided to destroy his own fleet on purpose. He ordered his 6 precious warships towed into the narrow Boca Chica Channel, the single deep-water gateway into the bay. There, in the tightest part of the passage, he had them blown open and sunk. To Vernon, watching from his flagship, this looked like panic. He assumed the Spanish were scuttling their own fleet in pure despair. He assumed wrong. Those sunken hulls were not a surrender. They were a wall. They choked the deep channel and forced Britain's enormous warships out of the water they understood into shallow, treacherous margins they did not. Several of the largest British ships drove straight into the mud and stuck fast, hulls grounded, suddenly frozen under the guns of the Spanish coast. If you are enjoying this story, take 1 second to subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of buried, brilliant history we rebuild here from the ground up. Now, stuck in the shallows and bleeding time, Vernon did what arrogant commanders always do. He reached for brute force, aiming all of it at the fort guarding the channel. The outer fort of Bocachica became the target of one of the most savage bombardments of the century. 120 British cannons opened up and did not stop. For 17 straight days and nights, iron rained on stone. The walls were ground into smoking rubble. Inside, barely 300 defenders held on, sleeping beside their guns. Think about what that meant for those 300 men. 17 days without real sleep, deafened, choking on dust and smoke, watching their own walls dissolve around them, one impact at a time. They held until the fort was simply gone, until stone could no longer be called a wall. Only then did the position finally fall to the British. And when Bocachica fell, Edward Vernon lost his mind with joy. To him, this was it. The gate was broken, the defenders crushed, the city wide open. He did not wait. He sent his fastest ships racing back across the Atlantic, carrying one triumphant message. Cartagena is finished. The Spanish are shattered. The city will fall within days. That message hit London like a national holiday. The bells prepared long before were finally rung. Parades flooded the streets, and the victory medals, the ones showing Blas de Lezo kneeling and begging, were officially handed to a cheering public. An empire celebrated the defeat of a man not yet defeated. In Cartagena, the real horror had not even begun. Here is the detail that changes everything. Blas de Lezo had never intended to hold the outer city at all. Losing Bocachica was not a disaster to him. It was the next step in a plan drawn in his head from the first day. He was not trying to stop the British at the walls. He was inviting them deeper. One by one, he pulled every soldier, every sailor, every last militiaman back from the outer defenses. He abandoned the city walls without a serious fight and concentrated his entire tiny force into a single point, a fortress on a hill, the castle of San Felipe de Barajas. Everything now depended on that one stone crown above the city. And San Felipe was no ordinary fort. It sat on a hill 40 meters high, built as a cold geometric puzzle designed for one purpose: to funnel any attacker into narrow approaches where every step forward walked into overlapping fields of fire. There were no easy angles, no wide fronts, just killing lanes engineered to turn numbers into corpses. Do you see what Lezo had done to Britain's greatest advantage? 30,000 men are terrifying on an open plain. On a steep, narrow hill with room for a few hundred at a time, they are just a line waiting to die in shifts. By choosing that hill, Lezo erased the 10-to-1 odds. The math began to bend. Vernon felt the clock now, and the clock was against him. His supplies were shrinking. The tropical heat pressed down, and something worse was beginning to move through his camps, something he did not yet understand. He needed the city fast. So he gambled everything on one violent stroke, a massive surprise assault under the cover of night. He chose the 19th of April. He handpicked 3,000 of his most hardened, battle-tested soldiers, the best men in the fleet. The plan was cruel and simple: climb the dark hill in total silence, raise heavy wooden ladders against the walls of San Felipe, pour over the top and slaughter the Spanish garrison in their beds before they woke. At 2 in the morning, the British elite began to climb, and it worked at first. They moved up the black slope without a sound. They reached the base of the great walls, and not a shot came down at them. The Spanish sentries seemed asleep. The British officers must have smiled in the dark. They ordered the ladders raised. And then the plan broke against a single, impossible detail. The ladders thumped against the stone, and a cold horror ran through the ranks. The ladders were too short. They did not reach the top. Soldiers at the highest rung found themselves stranded in open air, feet from the parapet, clawing at nothing, the wall still rising above their heads. Now, how does the greatest army on earth arrive with ladders that do not reach? They had measured the walls. Their engineers were not fools. The height was known, except it was not, because Blas de Lezo had changed it, silently, in the dark, in the nights before this exact moment, and no British scout had noticed a thing. In the days before the assault, Lezo had ordered his men to dig, not tunnels, but deep, wide trenches at the very foot of the castle walls. By carving the earth from the base, he made the walls taller without adding a single stone. The defenders could still fire down. The attackers now faced a wall no ladder could answer. So there they were, 3,000 of Britain's finest, packed together in the dark at the bottom of a wall they could not climb, confused, bunched up, blind, utterly exposed. It was the most vulnerable position an elite force could possibly be in, and that was the exact instant Blas de Lezo had been waiting for the entire time. He gave the order to open fire, and the night tore open. The parapets of San Felipe erupted in one continuous, deafening wall of musket fire and cannon. But these were not ordinary cannonballs. They were loaded with grapeshot, canisters packed with nails, rusted spikes, and shattered glass, turning each gun into a giant shotgun aimed down at the crowd. The effect was not a battle. It was a harvest. The blast swept through the tight British columns like a scythe through dry wheat. Men were ripped apart where they stood in seconds, faster than the mind could register. The ladders collapsed under the weight of falling bodies. There was nowhere to hide, no cover, only fire coming down. And Lezo was not finished. As the survivors turned to flee down the hill, he detonated the second half of his trap. Barrels of gunpowder had been buried along the paths of retreat days before. They exploded beneath the running men, throwing earth, stone, and bodies into the sky. What had been an assault became a stampede in the dark. By sunrise, the slopes of San Felipe were something out of a nightmare. The elite of the British army, the men chosen precisely because they were the best, lay in heaps across the hillside. In one single night, Britain had lost 1,500 of its finest, and Blas de Lezo, the half-man they came to humiliate, had lost around 30. Let that ratio sink in, because it is almost too lopsided to believe. 50 British dead for every Spaniard who fell, the most expensive army ever assembled, shattered in hours against a fortress held by a fraction of its numbers. But even this was not the thing that would truly destroy Vernon's army. The real killer had not yet spoken, because while the cannons had gone quiet, the swamp had begun to whisper. The British survivors pulled back into their camps, low ground, soaked by tropical rain, ringed by standing water and rotting jungle. And in that water bred the true weapon of Cartagena, one that no admiral could outplan and no soldier could outfight: disease. Malaria came first, then dysentery, sweeping through exhausted men whose bodies were already broken by defeat. But the thing that turned the camps into a living hell had a name the Spanish knew well: vomito negro, the black vomit. What Europe would come to call yellow fever, and against it, every surgeon in that fleet was completely powerless. You have to understand how this thing killed. A soldier would wake with a fever burning through him and his skin turning a sick yellow. Within days, he lay on a filthy cot, vomiting up black, half-digested blood. The camps filled with the stench of rot. There was no medicine, no cure, no defense, only the waiting and the carts. Every single morning, carts creaked through the British camps, stacked high with yellowed corpses to be dumped into mass pits and covered in lime. The fever did what the Spanish cannons could not. It killed faster, wider, and without mercy. Soon the dead from disease outnumbered the dead from combat, and every officer could see where this was going. Morale did not just drop, it evaporated. Men who had crossed an ocean certain of glory now watched their friends drown in their own black vomit. Some deserted straight into the jungle, choosing wild animals and the unknown over one more night in a camp that had become a slow, rotting grave. An empire's pride was dying in the mud. By the middle of May, Admiral Vernon finally looked at his mighty invasion force and understood the truth he had refused to see. Of the 30,000 men who had arrived so full of confidence, nearly 20,000 were now dead, dying, or too sick to lift a weapon. The largest armada in the world was now a floating hospital. On the 20th of May, 1741, the man who had minted coins of victory before the fight gave a very different order. Retreat. General, total, humiliating retreat. The shattered remains of the greatest fleet in British history turned and limped back toward Jamaica, beaten not in one grand battle, but ground down by fire, fever, and one stubborn, crippled man. And the voyage home was its own horror. Every day at sea, sailors wrapped the fresh dead in canvas, weighed them with cannonballs, and slid them over the side. The fever did not stay behind in Cartagena. It sailed with them. The ocean that had carried an invincible armada out now swallowed it, one body at a time. Now think back to those coins, to the bells, to the parades already held in London for a victory that had become the worst naval catastrophe in the nation's history. An empire had publicly celebrated a triumph that never came, and now the truth was crossing the Atlantic on those limping ships, and it would land like a bomb. When the real news finally reached London, the shock was catastrophic. The government that had rung the bells now faced the most humiliating, most expensive, most devastating naval defeat it had ever suffered, and it had celebrated that defeat as a victory in public for weeks. The scandal was so severe it threatened to bring down the entire government. So the British Empire made a choice. If the defeat could not be undone, then the defeat would be erased. Not lost, not forgotten by accident, erased on purpose. What followed was one of the most systematic, deliberate cover-ups any government has ever attempted against its own history. They did not just lose the battle, they tried to delete it. By royal decree, it became a crime to speak of Cartagena, a crime to write about it, a crime to publish anything describing what had truly happened there. Official documents, military journals, and ship's logs recording the disaster were seized, altered, or locked away in state archives under threat of court-martial. The defeat was legislated out of existence. And then came the strangest order of all. Remember the victory medals, the thousands of coins showing Blas de Lezo kneeling and begging? The crown now paid its own citizens a bounty to hand them back. Those coins were gathered and melted down one by one in a frantic effort to erase the face of the half-man from the world. It nearly worked. For decades, the single greatest defeat in the history of the Royal Navy simply did not appear in British history books. The largest fleet ever assembled had been destroyed, and an empire had quietly agreed to pretend it never happened. That is how dangerous the truth was. They would rather have no history than an honest one. But the cruelest turn in this whole story was not written by the British, it was written by the Spanish against their own hero. Because while Lezo had saved the empire, he had also made powerful men look small, and small men with power do not forgive that. The viceroy of Cartagena was about to steal everything Lezo had earned. Blas de Lezo never lived to see the full weight of what he had done. The siege had lasted 67 brutal days, draining the last of a body that had already given up a leg, an eye, and an arm. Weakened to nothing, he caught the same fevers killing the British. The half-man was running out of pieces to lose. On the 7th of September 1741, just 4 months after saving his empire from the greatest invasion it had ever faced, Blas de Lezo died. He had won the impossible victory. He had humiliated the most powerful navy on the planet. He had rewritten the fate of a hemisphere, and his own side made sure he got no credit. The viceroy, jealous and eager to claim the glory himself, buried the truth about who had really saved the city. Lezo, the man who had turned 10 to 1 odds into a slaughter, was laid in an unmarked grave. No military honors, his name barely mentioned in the official Spanish reports. The savior of Cartagena vanished into the dirt. So think about the full shape of this. On one side of the ocean, the British were melting his face off their coins to forget him. On the other, his own empire was burying him, nameless, to ignore him. Two rival powers, bitter enemies in every other way, briefly united in one silent agreement, that the half-man should be forgotten. But history is stubborn and some truths refuse to stay buried. Lezo's silent victory did something no coin and no decree could undo. It secured Spanish control over the trade routes of the Americas for another 80 years. Britain, for all its power, would never again dare an invasion of that scale there. One man had frozen an empire. And here is where this old story reaches into your world today. Look at a map of the modern Americas. Look at where Spanish is spoken. From Mexico down the whole spine of South America, hundreds of millions of people. Part of the reason that map looks the way it does is a mutilated admiral on a hill in 1741. Had Cartagena fallen that spring, the throat of Spanish America would have belonged to Britain, and the balance of a whole hemisphere could have tipped another way. The languages, the borders, the nations you see now might all wear a different shape. So much of what feels permanent was actually decided over a few desperate nights on one Caribbean hill. There is one last thing worth sitting with. The British were so sure of winning that they built the trophies before the fight. They turned certainty into metal. And that arrogance was the exact blind spot Blas de Lezo used to destroy them. He did not just defeat an army. He defeated the belief that the strong always win. And that is the quiet warning buried in Cartagena. Certainty made the British stop watching. They were so busy celebrating that they never asked the one question that mattered. What if the broken old man on the hill is not broken at all? By the time they asked it, 1,500 of their best were already dead on the slope. Because that is the real weapon in this story. Not the cannons, not the trenches, not the buried powder. It was arrogance, Britain's own, and a single mind patient enough to weaponize it. Lezo let them feel invincible. He let them mint the coins and ring the bells. Then he used that overconfidence to bury them. Every advantage the British had was real. More ships, more men, more guns, more money, more glory. And everyone was turned into a liability by a man with one leg, one eye, and one arm, standing on a hill, refusing to accept the math. That is what makes this one of history's most stunning upsets. So the next time someone tells you power always wins, that the biggest army simply rolls over the smaller one, remember the coins. Remember the bells that rang for a victory that never came. Remember an empire so ashamed of losing that it made losing a crime, and paid good money to melt the evidence into slag. Remember that the largest fleet the world had ever seen was broken on a Caribbean hillside by 3,000 men, and a commander history was ordered to forget. The strong do not always win. Sometimes they lose so badly they have to rewrite reality just to live with it. That is the true story of Cartagena de Indias. Blas de Lezo had no whole body, no fleet, no fair chance. He had a mind that saw the trap before the enemy walked in, and the will to spring it. He gave his last strength to a city that forgot him, and an empire that stole his glory. He lost all but the one thing that mattered. He won. The half-man died believing he had been erased. He never knew that centuries later his name would outlive every admiral who tried to bury it, that statues would rise in his honor, and that the coins meant to humiliate him would become proof of the worst humiliation the Royal Navy ever suffered. Time gave him the last word. And maybe that is the lesson worth carrying out of 1741. That arrogance is heavier than any armor, that the confident empire is often the blind one, and that a single clear mind, willing to be underestimated, can undo the certainties of the whole world. The mightiest force on earth was beaten not by size, but by a better plan. If this story showed you a piece of the past you were never taught, that is exactly what we do here. Subscribe and stay with us, because history is full of these buried turning points, these forgotten hills where the whole world quietly changed direction, and we are only just getting started digging them all back up.